There's that smile. I'm so glad you put it on for the show, Jason. If the folks could only see what it was like 10 seconds before, just a mere 10 seconds ago, it was storm clouds and gloomy and gray. But that intro, it's a banger. And Tyler's help behind the scenes, we got you.
Well,
we
that's
got you up and
what's making me
moving.
laugh is Tyler's dance choices are awfully suspect. Like, should you really be spanking your own ass while you're dancing?
Up on the chair, nonetheless.
Yeah, it was a little
Well,
disconcerting.
okay. Well, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Pirates of Finance. We are pre-recording this episode as well, just like last week. Unfortunately, Jason and I have busy travel schedules. I don't want to say like bring back COVID, obviously, but there are some aspects that I certainly wouldn't be upset about. Not traveling again would be great. So, okay, but before we dive in, let's talk about all the pre-disclosures we got to talk about. So this is not financial advice. It's two random guys on the internet. Actually, for all you know, we're not even real people. From the AI stuff I'm seeing lately, we could be completely fabricated entities. You absolutely don't want to be taking advice from chat bots or real people on the internet, particularly when it comes to your personal finances. Make sure you talk to a professional. We're just two random guys chatting about things that interest us. Now, Jason, you told me today you were putting out fires all day. You had a little trouble carving out the time to think about topics. Don't worry. I got you. I'm gonna carry you on my back. I'm gonna be Luke Skywalker. You're gonna be Yoda, and we're gonna get through that Dagobah swamp together. So,
By the way, in your intro, do you think that it made me think like, are we really real guys on the internet? Like, do you think we're just like figments of like Jim Oshag's mind, and this is like the singularity of Oshag Ventures? Is like he conjured us up with his AI investments, and we just seem like we're two middle-aged guys talking about finance.
It is absolutely possible that we're all just living in a simulation here. Yeah. Look, I mean, I saw a great app today that was you gave Drake a prompt and it would write a Drake song for you using that prompt. It was brilliant. I loved it. I'm going to be using it tirelessly.
Do you think that there's been pushback though on that, like Chat GPT-3 now? Like I'm hearing people like go, "Oh, it was cool." They got really excited when they're playing around with it, and then they're like, now that they're trying to put it, like utilize it in their business or in their Slack channels, and everything, they're kind of like, it's kind of still novelty.
Like all things, it's probably better than where a lot of people think it is, and not as great as where the dreamers think it is. But it's progressing, right? I mean, the scary thing to me about all the AI stuff is without the transparency to know where it's pulling the information from, you really have to question the information sources and what are the sort of counter attacks that can be done potentially to overweight incorrect information in learning systems like that. You know, if there are nefarious actors and that is an online learning system that's constantly evolving, how can it be tricked into learning incorrect information?
And then you just referenced is actually what Sam Altman's been saying is like the people that think it's terrible, it's better than that. And then the people that think the future's coming in the next 6 months, it's not going to happen that quickly. So yeah,
it's somewhere in between.
Somewhere in between.
All right. I'm going to make a hard pivot here, Jason. We're going into our first topic. I want to talk about your favorite podcast, which is not this podcast. It's
Flirting with models.
It's not your own podcast. It's not my podcast, which really raises the question, why do you hate us so much? But I want to talk about My First Million. So I'm like, you are an avid content consumer. I'm a pretty low end content consumer. But I listen to a lot of podcasts when I'm traveling. I find they're great for airplanes, great for just in the airport. So I was churning through some My First Million episodes, and I stumbled across this section. I think it was in a recent episode where they were talking about hiring research assistants, particularly for help with the podcast. And I can never remember whether it's Sean or Sam talking. One of them was talking about their process and saying the test they give research assistants is they say, come up with content, but put it in this particular format. He wants a frame. So the frame for the content is, how am I going to bring up this topic out of the blue? The example he gave is, let's say they stumbled across an interesting growth hack instead of just saying, here's an interesting growth hack, he would talk about, here are my 3 favorite growth hacks from the past year. So you're putting a frame around the content. Then there's sort of the supporting evidence section, 4 or 5 interesting talking points for the guys to talk about. And then finally, what's the take? And as I sort of thought about that, there was this moment where I felt like I knew the trick behind the illusion. Right? Like, it wasn't just these guys are really good at creating a podcast and they're just riffing and they're buddies who know each other well. It was like, this is pre-scripted in a weird way. It felt less authentic. And I feel like that keeps happening. We all sort of collectively maybe want to have the magic there with some content creators, right? It makes me think of, at the most extreme, like Liver King. Clearly the dude was on steroids, but everyone just decided to ignore that and pretend like his lifestyle was real, and he blew up to massive popularity. But I even know folks like Patrick O'Shaughnessy, who everyone says is a fantastic podcast host, and I think he is. He has researchers who create a dossier for him on every guest that comes on, right? He's not doing all the legwork himself. He has a team. Nick Bear, who we talked about last week, 16 people on his media team that go scout locations and record him. Like, it's not a single person endeavor. And I don't know, there was just something about it that made me feel like you pull back the curtain and you see that the wizard is just a man pulling some strings. And I don't know, I felt really like sad about it for a while.
This is kind of like shocking to me in a way. But yeah, I think it was Sam was talking about hiring a researcher, and then Sean said, here's my hacks for you to hire the researcher, and this is what I'm looking for. But then, yeah, I was thinking about the framing too, and it was like, give me the start with how do I insert this into a conversation like sui generis, like without like, apropos of nothing. And I'm like, you can't do that. One, that's also a skill, right? Like in general, like the way I think about it in that sense is I really take, dining and going out to dinner and doing progressive dinners and swashbuckling very seriously. But what I do when those days do come is I probably have 7, 8, 10, 12 different restaurants, bars, whatever in my head. And then as the day's progressing, I'm going to slowly change and adjust like where we're going based on the vibe and how everybody's feeling. Now, to your point, is that pre-planned, or am I kind of working within those constraints and just going with the flow? So it's a little bit of serendipity involved with a bit of pre-planning. And that's kind of the way I look at it. So same thing with their podcast. What I don't think a lot of people realize, like maybe that you're just coming to realize, is like, one, the amount of people that we always talk about that are involved in these things, like how big the teams are for people to produce great content, which is great. How many people are using researchers. And then not only that, My First Million is usually put out at least minimum a week after they record. So they go back in and they have editors and everything as well. And even though you and I are pre-recording this, like we have never edited a podcast. I don't think I've ever edited any podcast I've ever done. It's ever somebody had like a compliance issue they needed to take out of it. And so I've always said to you and I, like, this is a terrible idea. Like, we are working without a net, and nobody, I think smartly in finance, nobody's willing to do that. Like, you and I are just talking off the top of our head, no idea what we're going to talk about, and we just go and ramble. And to me, I think there's a weird, for lack of a better term, value in that, because we're doing something different from what everybody else is doing. But what I think you might be getting in that is by having frames, by having structure, by having researchers, by having editors, you maybe produce a higher quality piece of content than what we can produce by just babbling nonsense on a weekly basis.
Well, the other thing it makes me think about is a lot of these content creators give the same advice.
Yes.
They say, you just got to create content. You just got to do it. You just got to do it. But I wonder if that worked in an era a decade ago when the quality of the content was lower. And now the moat is bigger because the content creators who succeeded keep reinvesting in how they're creating content. They reinvest in the teams, they reinvest in the quality of their mics and their studios, right?
They turn off their phones when they're recording.
They turn off their phones when they're recording. They actually consciously think about this stuff. And it makes me question whether you can actually come up in the same way, or whether you need to now say, you want to know what? If I want to do this seriously, I need to make the hard investment in equipment, and I need to make the hard investment in people.
Well, I know this is what's interesting is actually we were just talking about this before we got on. Part of me though makes me second guess and wonder. Like for example, you and I have been tracking and following this space, especially YouTube creators, going on, I don't know, 5, 7, 10 years now. And it is interesting, like they all aggregate towards these answers. Like your thumbnail needs to have this, or you need to like put these colors in there. It needs to be this long. People's attention spans are X. And everybody's just guessing. And they're trying to guess about the YouTube algorithm. And because they're guessing, they end up in groupthink, right? Where whatever like Mr. Beast does, then everybody tries to copy, right? And everybody thinks that's the way to blow up, not thinking about all the other intangible aspects. So same thing is like, I really wonder is like, you go, okay, we look at My First Million, right? Look at these guys invested in their cameras, their mics, their background, their lighting, their whole team. And it's like, did that actually move the needle, or is it them putting out consistent content for 3 years and they just hit a J curve? Like it's impossible to actually know, right? And so, and then the other part of that is, I was actually having this conversation with this guy that was in fashion last night, and we were talking about how like how crop pants are like have been the in thing for the last few years, but now you're seeing baggy and big come back with like large breaks in the pants, and that's just fashion, right? It waxes and wanes, and it goes in one extreme to the next. So maybe, and then as you know with TikTok is like, the actual more face to camera on your phone, the more janky it is, the better return maybe you get on the investment, or the more people eyeballs, because it has a realness to it. And so I don't know what the right answer is. But I'm always dubious of if the right answer is to spend more money, build the team, and invest in higher quality equipment.
Are you telling me that really muddy, grainy YouTube thumbnails are making a comeback?
No, you just don't. What I'm saying is like, if you do something different, you're going to stand out. And then pretty soon that become the norm, and that will become part of the zeitgeist, and then you'll have to do something different again. It's like you gotta like, you go with the grain but against the grain. It's like trend following and mean reversion, right? And I could, by the way, I could spin that into another topic on stocks if you want, but like let's stay on this topic.
I do think you're onto something though, where there is this convergent groupthink, and then they all think, oh, the algorithm's rewarding this. I think there is something to the idea that they are all the successful content creators. Their videos are going to get clicks regardless, right? And so people just are going to end up copycatting, and it looks like it's working, but I think it's just one of those, like, that becomes the de facto norm. It's not necessarily standing out in a better way. I would love if I log into YouTube and didn't see these stupid faces everywhere with the
but even that's going away, don't you think? But part of that too is I wonder, you and I haven't talked about in a while, is like what scares me that we don't really want to admit is how much like the Pandy Wandy gave a bump to all of us, right? People were sitting around, they had time to watch YouTube, they had time to listen to podcasts. And I just don't think people,
I disagree.
It's changed dramatically, even though like your podcast is still growing. So mazel tov.
No. I think podcasts took a massive hit.
During COVID or after COVID?
During COVID.
Really?
Yeah, so YouTube seemed to spike because people wanted content to watch. But from all the podcasters I've spoken to, podcasts took audio-only podcasts.
Yeah,
took a massive hit because no one was in their car anymore. No one was commuting. And a lot of that's gone away permanently with remote work. And so a lot of that time that was carved out in the day for, obvious, like you could do the podcast on your way to work in a train or whatever, just doesn't exist. People have replaced it, and they're not finding new time in the day for podcasts. So I actually think from the folks I've spoken to, the pandemic worked against them from a content perspective.
Yeah. So going back to what I was afraid of when you brought this up, because when you do bring these up from time to time, what scares me, not scares me, but like in general, like terms, is that you want to go for a more structured approach because you see that works for others. And I keep being like, but is that the path, right? Like, I
want to go for a more structured approach because I'm OCD.
Yeah, exactly. I'm always. That's what I'm saying. You're always trying to push it towards structure, and I'm trying to push back and make it as unstructured as possible. Because to me, it's like, if you want structured, that's everywhere else in our space, especially interview style. Like, we got away from that because it's like there's a lot of great interviews out there, but like nobody's really having conversations. Nobody's listening to each other. And I think about this a lot. Like even when we're doing this, like, I have these notes next to me and everything. And while you're talking, I might take notes. And it's really, really hard to listen as soon as you hit record and put those mics up. And so in interviews, it makes a bit more sense, but it's really, really hard to have conversations on mic. I think it's a skill that and really need to work on and develop, because normally, like, if when you and I are talking on the phone, we're just intently listening without a care in the world. And then when we're doing this, you're like, oh my God, what if he stops talking? I blanked out for a second. What do I got to talk about next? It's like you have all these secondary, tertiary things going on in your mind, and it's really hard to actually have a conversation.
Yeah, I completely agree. It is when you're talking on the phone, you don't care about anyone else listening to the conversation. When you're doing something like this, you actually think about, am I choosing the appropriate words? Am I saying what I want to say clearly? It's less organic, even as organic as we want to make it. So, all right. With that, I'm going to transition to another subject, something more interesting, in my opinion.
Before you do, can you, because you brought it up, I want to know like what you thought of framing, like the 3 steps to framing, right? Of inserting into a conversation, having like 3 to 5 bullet points, and then having a takeaway. What were your thoughts on the framing? I don't,
So I thought the aspect for them, having listened to a couple of, well, not more than a couple episodes at this point, is framing was less about the transition. All the time, they say, I'm going to go on to the next topic. Like, they clearly have a bullet list of topics they want to talk about. They frequently mention moving on to the next thing. So to me, the framing was less about the transition or the natural transition, and it was more about finding a broader set of things to talk about, where that interesting piece of information was an example and not necessarily the whole conversation. So as an example to that, Sam or Sean, again, I can't ever remember which one is which, bought a car from the Twitter car dealership guy. And instead of having that be the topic, which is interesting, that whole process, he made the topic about sort of this guy mafia. There's all these Twitter accounts that are the something guy. And so it was, okay, the frame is the guy mafia. Let's talk about all these accounts. Interesting talking point. You know, I bought a car. Why did I buy a car from this guy? How do these accounts create trust? What should their business model be? What's the take? There shouldn't just be guys. There should be women as well doing this. And they can do it for all sorts of industries that men can't, as well as they should do it in the industries and compete with men. That there should be the car dealership woman or whatever it is. So, right. I think the structure of what they do is really interesting. I think it's interesting to think about it from having a concept and pulling back to a broader narrative. And they're content creators, right? They've done this with newsletters. So they understand the structure of content and what tells an interesting story. And I think ultimately that's the through thread, is that being able to tell an interesting story and an interesting narrative gets people to keep listening, gets them wanting to come back to listen. And if you can organize your content to sound like an interesting story, it's just going to be way better.
Well, that's part of what they're saying with having the researchers create the framing. They even started to admit is like, that's great storytelling, and very few people are good at great storytelling, right? That's right. A special skill set on its own. Second, speaking of like improving the podcast and everything, like, do you just not have a light that you can shine on your face, or do I need to send you one? Is that,
I have ordered a light. I just got a note this morning. It's to be delivered. Listen, man, I'm living in a basement.
Yeah,
I don't know what to tell you.
But also, and then I think that was pretty fortuitous for Sean to talk about, the guy mafia thing and how that was like a great frame for them. But like, they're not always great at framing stories too. They're kind of all over the place in the sense of the way we are too, and like no shade on that at all. So it's kind of a bit of a revisionist history, I think, too. And then the other part of it is like, even Sean's talked about in the past, like they've gone to like what do you call it, speech coaches or whatever it is, to get better. Almost like as, former professional players do, to be like on camera, on mic talent. And so it begs the question, like, is this what you want? Do you want to be one of the best podcasters in the world? You want to be professional?
Did you really just do that to me again? Did you really just beg the question again?
See, so unprofessional.
Buddy.
Yeah.
Buddy, I feel like you're teaming up with the commenters who just love sniping at me. They're just in the comments sniping all day long. No, I agree. Like they talk about, they're both sort of, I don't want to say doing nothing, because they're actively investing in certain things, but they're talking about having the show be their full-time gig.
Right.
For me and you, this is nowhere near our full-time gig. Right. So it's a question of, again, Like, are you reinvesting because you want to and it's fun? Are you trying to, what are you trying to do with this? You and I are doing this because we just like having these conversations and think that there's interesting content to create, and like we like experimenting with this stuff. So, you know, again, I'm not saying we should hire a researcher. I also don't like the idea of hiring a researcher. You know me, I'm a control freak. I like having like doing the work. I don't want someone to hand me a dossier about someone or a topic and assume they did the research correctly. What if they give me the completely incorrect facts?
This is so funny because we have talked about a lot of other people that have researchers and how bad the research is. So that's one thing. And you are completely OCD about it. That's great. I mean, I'm OCD in different ways. But then the third part of it is I think that both of us, the whole point of the show is we talk about things that interest us. So if a researcher bringing a topic, like we've had this in the past where people brought topics to us and we're like, I don't give a shit. And then you're like, so what do you talk about? Like, so it's more about like what just interests you and I. And I'm not sure a researcher can ever pull that. But I don't know. Sometimes I worry too that if we flip this around, that we're making excuses, right? Like we don't want to, you don't have a researcher, we don't have professionals, maybe we don't have professional equipment because like we just do this as for funsies on the side. But maybe we're just being, you know, wimps about it because we don't want to actually go full force or we have an excuse or something.
I'll tell you what's unprofessional is me deciding to drink a latte on camera.
Milk was a bad choice.
Well, I do this all the time. I'm like, I just need a refreshing drink for the podcast. Certainly milk will be good for something you're going to spend an hour talking. Like, what am I don't, that's, you know, that's what I need an assistant for, to just smack it out of my hand when I go to drink it. Okay. I'm changing because if we had an assistant, Jason, unfortunately, we might have to fire them. Times are tough out there. It is layoff season. What do you think about that transition? Nice. It's layoff season. I watched an absolutely hilarious video. I actually feel bad saying it's hilarious, but it was, have you seen those like day in the life at Google, day in the life at Meta videos? And it's like, I got up at 9 a.m. and then I walked to Meta and then I got my free breakfast. I sat down and did an hour of work. I went to lunch at 10 a.m. I went for a 4-hour stroll in the gardens, right? So it was that video. And then the very last clip was the woman going, and then I got fired. And I was like, that was pretty well edited because it was 2 different videos. But so Google announced 12,000 layoffs. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Credit Suisse, BNY Mellon combined 15,000 in layoffs. I think Goldman was the largest layoff since 2008. I don't want to talk about the economic implications of it, though I do have some views there. What I want to talk about is severance. So Google is offering 16 weeks salary and 2 weeks for every extra year that you worked at Google. You're going to receive your 2022 bonus. You get all your remaining vacation time. I think those are legal requirements. You're going to get 6 months of health care, and they will continue to help you with job placement services. Goldman let go of 3,200 people, and the CFO of Goldman said that the ongoing cost savings will be about $200 million a year, so about $68,000-$70,000 per head. Guess what the upfront costs of the layoff are? Just throw a number out there.
So they're going to save $70 million a year. What's the upfront cost
of
that?
They're going to save $200 million a year. $70K per employee was the average spend.
I'm going to go $50 million.
$275 million. They are paying more in severance and upfront costs to get rid of these people than they will recoup in having them gone for a year. And here's what I don't understand. And I hope none of my employees are listening because they're going to get scared if they ever get laid off. I don't understand severance. In the United States, severance is totally optional. And maybe I just am a complete asshole, but I don't understand. It's like, we don't have the money to keep you hired anymore. We don't need your job. Goodbye. We're going to keep paying you for half a year. I don't get it. People, when they get fired, they expect severance. Why should you get severance when you're fired?
Like you said, it's optics, right? Especially for the larger, Fortune 100 companies. And like you said, that's great. The actuarial tables that people come up with, that is like basically a break even on year one on your LTV, and then like you're hoping to recoup it after that. Because I mean, how do you know what your my favorite, the DCF, your cash flow model, is going to be in year
That's
two?
right.
Like you just don't know if that was actually a break even or not. And this is why it's incredibly thought provoking, even your hiring process, right? Because as you said, it's very costly to fire somebody.
It's
Whether
costly to hire people. It's costly to fire
yeah,
them.
from all aspects of it, both tangible and intangible. The other thing that I was so glad actually when you brought this up, because it was one of the things I haven't talked to you about that I always wanted to. It's like, I love how now it's called a RIF, a reduction in force. It's like
Yes.
how we change these things once again, because this is why I think it's optics, right? Before that was redundancies, before that was laid off, before that was like you got fired or shit canned,
Right.
right? Like now
Right.
it's like, but they need to go through a riff, and it's like we keep creating all these cuddly terms, and you and I talked about this before
Well,
with
I
like a
do think
rug pull.
I hate to interrupt. I do think like the language has changed to the benefit of the person for their future career, because to say I got fired has the implication you did something wrong or is for
Yep.
not doing your job correctly. You got laid off means they were doing cuts at the firm. The firm wasn't doing well. It wasn't necessarily performance related. So I do think that distinction in language is useful, but I agree it does keep getting softer and softer.
I want to come around to the economics impacts of this in a second, but how much do you think, for example, on the All In podcast, when those guys are giving a reach around to their buddy Elon, they're all saying that this, like, Elon opened up the door for all this because he showed people you could reduction in force of like 60-70% of employees and still be fine. Like, you're shaking your head.
No, this has nothing to do with Elon. This is just the part of the cycle. They massively overstaffed in the last 2 years. A ton of the people that are reporting getting fired are people like recruiters. Like, why does Google need a ton of recruiters if they're not planning on hiring? That's headcount they can easily get rid of. And it's not just, and I think employees, they often just think, oh, it's my salary. It's not just your salary. It's your salary and all the benefits. And that's not, and all the payroll taxes, right? And that's not just like your healthcare benefits. That's all those free things you got at Google. That was part of your compensation plan. So when Google thinks about firing you, they add all that up and they can save a ton of money.
Yeah, said by a business owner. That's why I love when you ever see those charts that show like wages have been stagnant since like the 80s or whatever. It's like, yeah, but pennies have gone up exponentially and you have to cover all
Yes.
that stuff. So too. So it's like it's almost like doubled the actual all-in cost for the employer side. But when you were saying like they overhired, so it's just like we always talk about bullwhip effects and supply chain. So whether it's supplies and commodities or people, we over index, right, going in both directions. And I'm not sure we can have, there's no like reversion to the mean because there's no mean there, and it's incredibly difficult. So like we're talking about the economic impacts. Like how much do you think about like a recession is really just an epiphenomenal effect of people mirroring each other. So when everybody sees that like these layoffs happening and everybody else going to lay off, and it just creates a cascade effect where it's really just in its impressions by people of what's going on in the greater world out there, and everybody's just reacting to each other.
Yeah, I think there can be some of that. I think large organizations, unfortunately, it's hard for them often to do little small bouts of layoffs.
Yeah.
For them to make a difference in their bottom line and prepare for any sort of economic hardship to come, they have to be fast with layoffs. There's stories of firms going through 2008 who all navigated it in different ways. Some did big layoffs. Some asked people to just take a lower salary so that they could keep their entire staff. And there's different ways about it. But my guess is the recession is not, well, it's not even, we're not even necessarily in a recession, but the recession people are expecting isn't so deep that people at major firms are going to go, yeah, I'll take a 70% haircut just to retain my job. Right? You don't have that sort of group camaraderie the way you did in some industrial firms in 2008. When things got tough, everyone agreed it would be better to just get less pay so everyone could retain work rather than, play the game of Russian roulette.
Yeah, and I'm remembering actually when I did an interview with our buddy Travis, and he was talking about like at SaaS companies, how almost like you have to fire even quicker. And you going into like you start to see the effects there before anything else. And I was saying, how difficult is that as an operator to have to like fire all these people? And he's like, the way he, understandably justifies in his own mind is like you have to save the people that are still there.
Right.
And so you have to provide a living for them. As you know, these decisions are never easy. They're incredibly difficult, and heavy is the head wears the crown.
Yeah, it's not fun. It's not fun having to fire people or lay them off. I've had both scenarios. You get to know people over time, and they all have families. They all are, most people are trying. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, and you got to let them go. And you do hope it is better for both in the long run. But it's kind of like breaking up with a significant
Yeah.
other. It's like, yeah, it still sucks. No one wants to go through it, but hopefully there's better things on the other side.
What I always wondered is when this was to me an inevitability, right? That we think everything's waxing and waning and everything goes through cycles, is how much this was going to affect work from home. It was interesting where the employees could push back and said they want to work from home, but now that people are laying off tens of thousands of employees, and maybe jobs are scarce again, and if the employer says no, I want you in the office, does that dramatically change the work from home, or do you think it's here to stay? I really don't know either side of that argument.
Well, I was thinking about was the amount of benefits that could be saved if you were an employee who said, I want to work from home and I'm not going to be coming to the campus. I'm not going to be eating the food. I'm not going to be taking the free drinks. And by the way, I'm not expecting higher compensation. I'm now just going to be paying for my own breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It doesn't seem like a lot, but if it's $50 a day per employee and you got half your workforce no longer coming in and you're a mega company like Google, that's a ton. The other problem with it, though, is you have this massive commercial real estate footprint that you're no longer using, right? And if you can downsize that, that's great. But most of these firms aren't going to be able to downsize their campuses. So I agree with you. There may be that competitive edge that goes to those employees willing to go back and be seen, right, by the senior staff who are there. I also think, and maybe this is controversial, I think it is to the detriment of junior employees to not have an office for the most part. I think particularly in industries where there is some sort of important learning, structured learning that goes on. I think that happens in finance. I think it happens in tech. I think it happens in most places. The inability to build your personal network and to get hands-on learning and rapid feedback in an office environment. I know we all like staying at home, but I think if you were a junior employee, it is massively detrimental to your long-term career progression.
And there's that tacit knowledge, right, that you can really gain from being in person. But I also wonder, along those lines, like right now, you're seeing the real estate costs, and you and I had a lot of conversations when we're walking around about real estate, like how hard it is to predict, even though it seems so easy to predict real estate, whether it's residential or commercial, is the amount of empty square footage in San Francisco. And if cap rates are going back up and everything, like, is this a generational buying opportunity in San Francisco, or is San Francisco dead on the commercial real estate leasing front?
I mean, if there's been, right, this is a question of cyclical versus structural.
Right.
If this is cyclical, it's a buying opportunity. If this is a structural change in the way that we are going to operate as a workforce, yeah, that's not a buying opportunity, right? Because there's still a lot of real estate to be let go of.
But as you know, like the great part about that is you're making a bet, and it's decision making under opacity. In only hindsight will the people be seen as geniuses that got it right. But like
Right.
the survivorship bias is we won't know all the people that got it wrong, depending on which way it goes. But that's always so interesting about that. Like
Yeah, I think
saying the other. Yeah, go ahead.
the optimal choice is if you can get that real estate and utilize it. To buy it as an investment, right, is an inherent prediction on cyclicality versus structural shift, or whether you think the market is overswung for whatever structural shift will occur, right? But if you can utilize that footprint, I think the cost can be lower. The cost of carry can be lower, obviously.
Right. And like you're saying, then you're also overlaying it's a bet on rates, and then it's a bet on regionalism, like you're saying, structural regionalism of different cities or different MSAs or whatever you're looking at. As we're talking about like these waxing and wanings and these allostatic bands and things rising and falling. Our buddies at Verdad had one of their papers came out, and it's just like one of their normal essays like that we get like on there was a daily or weekly emails. I think it's weekly emails. And it was talking about once again, growth, large cap growth versus small cap value, right? And it was going back and studying, 2000 to 2002. And what I always wonder about this, because we were talking about even the layoffs and going into recession, is these self-referential feedback loops or the self-fulfilling prophecies. Is yes, if you go back and study 2000 to 2002, large cap growth took a hit and small cap value, closed that delta, right? But everybody knows that happened. So does that happen again, or people are already betting on that to happen? Is like, what I'm saying? Like, if you already know it happened in the past and people bet on the future, it's like the game keeps changing. Like, how do you really think about that?
Well, this is where I think Mike Green's passive thesis also comes in a bit, right? Because markets are adaptive. So if everyone thinks that it's 2000 is playing out again, you would expect everyone to have moved into value, which means the value move would have been front run. The reality, though, is that sort of only kind of happened. Value spreads are still massive. Growth
Right.
still very expensive relative to value. And part of Mike Green's argument is that the amount of structural inflow into passive investment vehicles, like 401ks as our investment plan, the qualified default, and how people save today, and the amount of money that just goes into passive ETFs is making that price discovery harder. That people aren't even making that choice anymore because they've been so indoctrinated into the world of passive. And so there's not enough money to move the needle. So it's a hard question, right? Because you would say in an efficient market, people would have already made that move. And yet it feels like that move hasn't happened. So has it not happened because the market doesn't believe in it? Market's not actually pricing it, or is it not happening because we've hit this wall with the amount of passive flow that's preventing active price discovery?
Yeah,
It's a tough one, because I will also say very clearly there was a lot of, and I'm using air quotes here for those listening, active price discovery in the last 2 years where all these tech meme stocks blew way out, right? They were able to move. So why can't value also move?
No, to your point, like, and this would be Mike's point too, is you're reducing the active stock pickers too that are left to pick small cap value and who can even come down to that level. But and then part of their paper too is almost related to what you're saying is market cap weighted to equal weight, and even worse than market cap weighted, they're float weighted. So it's always those bigger stocks. So they're showing how the index has taken even a bigger hit than market cap weight over the last last trailing 12 months or whatever it is. And that's interesting. Why do you think as that transition happens, what'll be interesting is you do go from large cap growth to small cap value in that index, but to get there is going to be incredibly violent for that index to turn over. But at the same time, what I always think is, especially in our space, we always have read these papers about equal weight, always fans equal weight. But why do you think equal weight's never really taken off? Do you think it's just a function of the massive amount of flows that have to go into these target date funds need these float weighted indices?
It might be. I don't have a good answer there. I really don't. I will also say performance chasing, I think, has something to do with it. When those funds are being developed, one of the things you have to think about is the fact that the fund management companies are going to be profiled against each other. And so even trivial things like, does your 2040 target date fund have more or less equity than mine? What's your glide path look like? Can give you a tailwind or a headwind depending on how markets behave. And so to add active stock picking in there, even something as simple as going from free float cap weighted to equal weight, can be a decade-long tailwind if small value underperforms. And so I think there are just a lot of companies for whom they would just rather be the low-cost, cheap option and vacuum up flows and be able to just very simply put their hands up and say, hey, we're giving you the passive market. We're making it nice and simple. We're not picking stocks, and therefore can't lose on that basis, right? Because winning to them is not beating the market. Winning is vacuuming up assets. And so the utility function, right, there's a mismatch between what the company wants and maybe what the investor wants. And so from that perspective, there's really no inherent benefit for them taking the active stock risk. By the way, can I just interject something, because you brought up Verdad? They did a 2022 annual update, and they had a great year. Congratulations to them. But there was one point that stuck out to me that was absolutely wild. So their AUM reached about 825 million. Yep. Phenomenal. They've been grinding away for years. But that includes 230 million for the Verdad Opportunity Fund 2, which is uncalled assets that will be called when high yield spreads cross 600 bips. Now, they did this in 2020. They announced a fund in January 2020 that said, we're doing this opportunity fund. If spreads cross 600 bips, we're going to call your money. We're going to invest it in these type of stocks. And then after a year or two, we're going to give it back. They did that, made an absolute fortune in carry, like an absolute fortune, and then gave the money back. And I don't want to be a dick, but they just invested in like small value stocks. Like I'm going to sound like a really big dick right now. I'm going to sound like a hater. Great for them. Awesome if they can pull it off. But I'm sitting here going, who is giving them $230 million? Like they're telling you exactly what their trigger is, and you know exactly what they're going to invest in. Why are you giving them the money? Just do it yourself. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills, Jason.
There's so many things like you were talking about, going back to the setting up frames and the My First Million being a little bit more structured than you thought, to then you're talking about that, the incentives for most people in our business are actually just to raise assets. It's actually not about performance. And then the third that you just brought up is like, why don't people just DIY it, right? And I think you know this as well as I do, is like if you go back to Joel Greenblatt's Magic Formula book and paper, and after it came out, they put up a website that said, look, here, you can run a screener. All you have to do is click search. It'll screen like the 20 Magic Formula stocks, and you can do it yourself. And every month or quarter, just click and hit this button again, right? And then change your allocations. And almost nobody did it. And they did research on this. And then they offered, hey, we'll do this for you. And everybody signed up. And so, once again, like you're saying, no shade on Verdad, like good for them. And, it's part of their marketing and
business.
High yield spreads
brilliant.
is what they do. Yeah. And they got the returns. Like you said, it's simple, but they got the returns. So great job. You did what you said you were going to do. But it comes down to, people,
I'm just a hater, Jason. That's what it comes down to.
You're
It's brilliant. I should give them more credit. Dan Rasmussen, kudos to you. I don't have the balls to put a fund together like that. I honestly don't, which is, again, kudos to him.
At the same time, okay, two things on that. One, they did the returns, so great. But not only that, did they get the returns and they did what they said they were going to do. They've been really banging this drum on the high yield spread, right? That's their thing in the last few years.
And they returned the capital, by the way.
No, that's what I was getting to. No, that's what I was getting to. The other one that's huge is they return the capital. How many people do we know that set up SPVs and then don't return the capital?
Yes.
Because it's so hard once you get that AUM, because you were just saying before, everybody in our business is an AUM gathering businesses. It's not a performance business. So for once they said, look, this is kind of capacity constrained. We're going to do this for a short period of time and then give the money back and no longer be able to pull those management fees. Like that is more impressive to me, that you actually did what you said on the tin and actually gave the money back. It builds that credibility.
they have this 230 million of uncommitted capital that they're not going to be charging fees on, that they might not call for 5 years. Like spreads could just stay low. It's entirely possible, or they could call it all and it could be a whipsaw and they end up spreads collapse. We saw that in 2018, spreads blow out and then spreads quickly collapsed, that they end up having to give the money back again. So it might not be, the nice 2020 year-long event. We'll see. Again, kudos to them, but I was blown away that they had 230 million in uncommitted capital.
Yeah, the bigger thing that jumps out to me that we're not really hitting on is the uncommitted capital and the callable nature of it. Is like that stuff just makes me laugh with PE and VC and all this stuff. When you have that dry powder and callable capital, it's like, and especially if you have a strategy that is supposed to take advantage of dislocative effects, is like when shit hits the fan and everybody's scrambling for cash, do you think they're going to give you that callable capital? Do you think they're going to break any sort of covenants in those contracts? All of that paper is going to get rewritten. And by the way, you look like an asshole if you try to take all your clients to court for it or something. Or
yes, but I think it also depends on what people are sourcing that capital from, right? I could see people saying we have a 60-40 portfolio, and I'm just using that as an example. We've got a whole bunch of short-term treasuries that we hold as part of that 40, and we're going to use that capital to invest in the SPV. Like you were making a strong tactical timed bet versus, right, saying I'm going to have money in the S&P 500, and when high yield spreads blow out, I'm going to use that capital to fund. Then you're making a bet on the types of stocks you're buying. You're not making an asset class timing bet. They're very different bets when you consider the funding source. The former, unless the US defaults, at least the money is there, right? If I have $100, it's not going to deviate meaningfully from 100. But if I have it in the S&P, by the time the money gets called, it could be worth 60, right? So it's a different consideration. But again, I was incredibly impressed that they have that set up. Good for them.
So continue on this idea of stock picking, and are there any stock pickers left, or like, or at least you can do these asset class SPV kind of plays? Is our homie Roni from Endeavor had a paper back in December, which I'm surprised we haven't talked about yet, that was called "How Many Stocks Should You Own?" And by the way, before I get into that, little sidebar here. Roni has been sending me some of his papers he's working on to kind of proofread and get some feedback on. Yet you do not do this. You paired up with Roni to write a recent paper. Did you show it to me beforehand? No, you just dropped it in my inbox today, an hour before we were supposed to record. Just like got it the same time as everybody else. Where's the love, man?
I didn't know you wanted to pre-read it. It's about my absolute obsession, rebalance timing lock, which no one in the world cares about. So
I have that mutual love. That started our bromance. We bromanced over rebalancing timing luck.
Listen, I sent it out to my mailing list with the presumption. By the way, I don't think I've had more unsubscribes from my mailing list than after sending out this research note. I have sent out egregious marketing emails and being like, hey, I published some new research. It was like, unsubscribe, unsubscribe. I mean, my sales guys were so mad at me.
Well, it's been a while since you like publishing a full-on paper like that, though, hasn't it? Or
yeah, I don't think I like a real academic research paper. I think the last one I wrote was 2019.
Well, when I do get a chance to read it, I can't wait to at least talk about it on this podcast. But as you know, I'm a huge fan of rebalancing timing luck. And by the way, Roni was saying the same thing, that like you think nobody cares about rebalancing timing luck. So he's like, why did we write this paper? And I'm like, I think people actually really do care. Does anybody do it though? To your point, you could tell people exactly what to do. They could DIY it, but like getting people to actually do it. But that's life, right? Like that's why people have all these, we've talked about the pickup artist community, right? They have all the lines and everything they're going to drop on women. When one guy said it best, he's like, if you see somebody you like across the bar and you make eye contact, shut your eyes and take a half step forward. Because if you don't take that half step forward, nothing you say matters, right? If you just stand there in your own head. So to your point is like, all the information in the world, or Siver says, if information was the key, we'd all be billionaires with six-pack abs. It's all about movement, execution, actually doing the thing that you believe in, right?
Yeah, I mean, the comment I will make here, because I do not think this is the sexiest thing to talk about, but there are very few things in our industry that I feel like I can say with the utmost confidence, right? It's just an industry filled with uncertainty.
Yeah.
I feel like this is an area that is totally discounted as a risk. It is a massive risk in the way that people manage portfolios. It's a massive risk in the way people benchmark portfolios and choose managers. Most people aren't even aware that it exists. There are 4 papers in the world that I'm aware of that talk about this, and I've written 3 of them. Right? And so when I say like no one cares, I mean no one cares, because they're just, if people cared, there would be more papers on this subject. I am literally trying to get the world to go from 0 to not even 1. I'm trying to get the world to go from 0 to 0.1. Just acknowledge this issue and acknowledge the way that portfolios are being built is just fundamentally wrong, in my opinion. And I can say that with a huge amount of certainty, because this isn't like, oh, you should pick stocks better for alpha. It's like the way that you are building portfolios and rebalancing them is introducing a completely unnecessary element of risk. You don't need to have this. You're not compensated for it. You can easily eliminate it. And yet no one does.
I always wonder, and we'll do a whole show on this. So I need to get back to what I was talking about. But I always wonder on this. It just really dawned on me is like the underlying bias or implicit assumption in why I think people don't pay as close attention when you're talking about is time, right? We think about calendars and time and fiscal calendars and fiscal years and quarterlies and all this stuff. And to me, the way I embraced rebalancing timing luck before we even ever met was that it was just like throwing time out the window. Like if you don't have time, you don't have a fiscal or annual year or budget, like you have to throw time out the window and rebalance in tranches. Like that's the only thing that makes sense, and not actually care what your quarterly or annual returns are. Who cares, from January to December? Who cares? Like it's over time. How do you compound?
And
but don't you think it's a form of arrogance?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, a lot of people choose dates out of convenience. It's very easy to rebalance at month end. That's just right. It's convenient. It's easy to rebalance at year end. It's convenient. And it does, in my opinion, create some seasonal effects. And there are absolutely seasonal effects in things like commodities, especially where you literally have different seasons. You buy a certain contract, it represents a different harvest, or it represents winter versus summer, and the demand is very different for that deliverable. But for things like equities, yes, there's earnings. But again, like when you're talking about a factor strategy, if you rebalance at the end of a quarter, for example, all the companies that report towards the end of the quarter, you have more recent information on than those that report at the beginning of the quarter. Like you are making a bias as to what information is more or less relevant to what you're doing, and it has a profound impact on the returns that you generate. So, that's what I'll say about that. You wanted to mention Roni.
Yeah, I'll get back to you.
I had a whole other topic I want to talk about.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So, but I'll go back. It'll be quick. I'll go back to your co-author Roni, and go check out like a lot of his papers he's starting to publish at Endeavor, NDVR, for anybody who wants to look it up. And the one we're talking about is How Many Stocks Should You Own is the title. And usually, the academic research comes back to 20 to 30. And I'll spoiler alert, it's about 10x that. Ideas we talk about with the fancy word ergodicity, right? Which is really just timing luck, terminal wealth, all of those things. And so
dispersion of terminal wealth is the way I like to think of it. Who I actually, so Roni published that paper, but the first person who clued me into this idea was actually Cliff Asness on Twitter. We're talking about this idea of, do you need multiple active managers in the same category? And you and I talk about this a lot, particularly with CTAs, where there's huge dispersion. And people often think, no, if you buy multiple managers, you're just going to average back to the benchmark. You're going to dilute. The reality is there are certain categories of active management that there's huge dispersion in managers, and there's other ones that there aren't. And what ends up happening is with those ones with huge dispersion in managers, you end up with very different terminal wealth depending on who you invested in. Now that seems obvious, but one of the ways to control for that is just investing in more of them. And so Cliff came up with a very terse example. He said, well, let's say you have a whole bunch of active managers who all pick 20 stocks, right? And let's just say they all have the same strategy. It's throwing darts. Go use a computer simulation and just randomly pick 20 stocks from the S&P 500 and hold that portfolio, rebalance it every year, whatever you want for the next decade, and do that 100 times. He said the dispersion between those managers is going to be massive. And that's what Roni's talking about here. They'll all have the same volatility. Those portfolios, their vol will almost be identical. But where they end up is massively different.
Yeah, what he's saying is that model focuses on the average risk, not the distribution, and you still have a ton of idiosyncratic risk. And then also the model ignores expected returns. So once again, it's just going back to you can get lucky or unlucky, and we're just talking about coin flips, and that's why you need a Monte Carlo simulator to really be able to look at this, which all have that technology now. But it's the same thing as even in advantage gambling or betting. Like even if you have a positive expected value, you still have a risk of ruin. And so that's what you're like getting at is like there's still a lot of luck embedded in only 20 to 30 stock portfolio that people don't realize. And that's why, the paper was one after my own heart of like it's probably more in that 2 to 250, 300 range. But then people go well, that's indexing. It's like not so fast. That's not exactly what they're talking about in the paper.
Yeah, it was pretty fascinating reading some of the comments on Twitter, the pushback where people were like, no, 20 to 30 is the right number because I can pick the right stocks. That's always what it comes back to. It's like, that's to get the vol low enough, but I can pick the right stocks.
Yeah, exactly.
Concentrated value, guys. All right. You almost set me up for the perfect segue about 20 minutes ago where you were talking about bullwhip effects.
I destroyed your frame. Sorry.
You had it, and then you just hard left off the highway. So I've been reading a book. This book is called The Lessons from the Titans. And it is 3 ex-Wall Street research analysts who all covered the industrial sector. And it talks about these mega industrial players like GE and Boeing and Stanley Black & Decker and Roper and a whole bunch of names that you probably, the people who make all the clips on an airplane, like your belt buckle. Why does every airplane have the same belt buckle? It's one manufacturer. All those little things like that, what industrial folks create. And the point that they're trying to make in this book is that as the tech firms get larger and larger, they should be looking to the industrial players from the last era to see the mistakes that they made, to avoid making those mistakes going forward. Because as the tech firms get bigger, they basically become industrial players within their own category. And I thought some of the topics here were interesting, but I'm going to save the punchline for the end. So I wanted to talk about an example of some of the things they talk about. So Stanley Black & Decker, you probably know at least the Black & Decker side of that merger. They make a lot of the power tools that you might see. Pre sort of reconfiguration, they had 140,000 SKUs, right? So think of that as individual purchasing items, 85,000 of which represented under 2% of their sales. So massive product lineup. About half of it, over half, was less than 2% of their sales. Now, what they were looking for, what all these industrial players are looking for, is what's called a high fill rate. So you walk into Home Depot or Lowe's trying to buy this product, you want to make sure it's on the shelf. They want a fill rate higher than 98, 99%. Well, how do you make sure you have a fill rate of 98, 99%? You end up needing lots of buffer inventory that you have to hold in a warehouse somewhere. And that's expensive and highly subject to the risk that preferences change and your inventory becomes obsolete. So it's highly costly. So what happened over time is all of these manufacturers, and a huge lesson from this book, is they all started adopting lean manufacturing. Now, this idea of lean manufacturing really came out of Japan as a post-World War II evolution. So Japan, after World War II, they lacked the cash and so it made it very difficult for them to finance sort of big batch, large inventory production. They lacked the space in Japan to build big factories. They lacked the natural resources to build a lot of products, and they had very high unemployment post-World War II. So their concern wasn't labor efficiency, right? So what they ended up with was this process where they needed to have smaller factories, very low inventory levels, and a high turnover in the natural resources they were deploying. And so to enable that, they went from a system where they weren't trying to project sales, right? They weren't trying to do production of product because they thought people would buy. They went from, which is more of a push mentality, but they went to a pull mentality. They wanted the demand. And all of this ultimately culminated in just-in-time production, right? Which absolutely stormed the world. Japan was really the leader of that. A lot of this was 1950s, 1960s Toyota production system, TPS as it's called. Americans ended up calling it lean in the late 1980s, adopted by almost every major industrial player in the 90s and 2000s. This book, I want you to guess when this was written, which is all about how great lean is in just-in-time production. When do you think this was published?
2016 to 2018, somewhere in there. Just before 2020.
2020.
Nice.
Which means they were writing it in 2019, right? For the book to get published, they were writing it 2018, 2019. And I couldn't help but laugh thinking about how much they're advocating for this lean system, this just-in-time production, knowing precisely how damaging the just-in-time production system was going to be during the COVID pandemic.
Got so many things in there. One, do you know what does SKU stand for?
Oh, I don't even know.
Well, I know it's so funny because we think we know it's stock keeping unit, which is obvious, but like
no, that makes sense.
It came up before and I didn't know it either. I was like, it's SKU. What do you mean? You know what it means? It's SKU.
SKU. It's a SKU.
Yeah, it's a SKU. Second, what the irony is, it's actually American consultants that came up with the just-in-time manufacturing in Japan because they weren't getting any traction in the U.S. because of the former Titans and Giants where they had slack in the system. The other part of that is like I want to say it's Rory Sutherland that always tells a story of like an aluminum or steel galvanizing facility that like they'd keep a lot of dry powder, a lot of inventory on hand, and just they wait for that once in a decade, that cyclicality, that crisis. And then they're the only ones that can actually provide the inventory. And so once every 10 years, they go from like 22% of the market to 26% of the market. Then they kind of just like they have too much, overstock of inventory that all the consultants tell them not to have. And then 10 years later, they go from 26 to 32% of the market. And each time that's when they just put the screws to the kind of the market and just take more market share. And like you're saying, because these things only happen every once in a while. But at the same time, this one's a hard one for me. Because obviously I believe in Slack and systems and everything, and we cannot over optimize things. But I also think it's easy because of the pandy wandy to, really shit on just in time manufacturing. Yet everything in our lives now is like we live these unbelievably wealthy lives because of just in time manufacturing. So I'm not sure what the actual answer is, right? Like, and especially like, and it should be different for different industries. Like if you're a hospital, yes, you should hold more inventory that is not very cost effective. But like, it just depends kind of what industry you're in. And then I always think about the benefits that we've all gotten from it. So I'm not sure what your takeaway was. And you're telling like more of the historical example, but
No, I actually agree with that. If you think about the potential economic benefits of avoiding misallocation of capital, as well as the environmental benefits of just having less waste, right?
yeah,
Creating less wasteful product that needs to eventually just, be thrown into, I don't know, the Mariana Trench or shot into space, maybe shot into the sun eventually. But either way, right, avoiding that waste is a good thing. I'm not anti just in time. The reason I wanted to bring it up because I know you think about these things, and I could tie it back to portfolios here, right? Which is you have all these competing businesses that the ones who can during the good times, who can over optimize during the good times, are going to perform better. They're going to get more cash flow, have more cash flow to reinvest. All right. And it's like every step they get in front of their competitors allows them another half step. And that can really compound in a way that a business can be put out of business if those good times last too long.
yes,
Right. You can do the right thing and go out of business simply because the bad times you were too conservative. The bad times never came around. You didn't push your luck. There's that balance in investing as well, right? You can be over levered and make a fortune. And if you cash out before any sort of issue, you look like a genius. Or
yep,
you go broke if sort of the drawdown ends up smashing you in the face. Conversely, you can be so afraid of investing, you invest too conservatively, underperform inflation, and you never meet your financial goals because you weren't able ever to really compound your wealth. And it's this like balance that needs to be struck. And I don't actually have a clear takeaway here other than it did seem like in the late, or I guess in the 2010s, these businesses all felt like they learned the lesson and kept pushing these just-in-time systems harder and harder. It feels like we should probably have some excess capacity, but unless they all collude to do it, right, there's going to be that one player who decides not to, and you sort of
right.
have like everyone's racing to the bottom of bad behavior.
Yeah, and then as you know, that one player during the risk on times is going to get like better loans from banks at lower interest rates. It's just going to keep their marginal advantage is going to keep compounding during that risk on time.
Exactly.
So yeah, and like you said, so then they just leave their competition then dust. But if you can figure out survivability, then like you said, you can put the screws in, when risk off happens. But to your point about portfolio construction, yeah, we think about it all the time. We think about building an under optimized portfolio with slack in the system. As we kind of think about, we have like two phrases. One, we're trying to build the least shitty portfolio. We're not trying to build the best portfolio. And then the other thing when we think about is offense plus defense wins investment championships, right? You need both. Or the other way, the phrase that we hear in our industry a lot is like during a bull market, you want a 20-year-old, and during a bear market, you want a 60-year-old. And to me, it's like why not just combine both? I mean, yes, it's under optimized during the risk on, and then
Says
it's
the
under
40-year-old.
optimized during the risk off. Yeah, exactly. On average,
I see how that works
a 40
for you.
yeah. On average, you want a 40-year-old. You want somebody that looks around and thinks that they're a cool kid, but then they're just an old grumpy curmudgeon on the inside. Does that describe both of us?
I absolutely agree with that take. One of my guiding principles when thinking about building portfolios is the assumption that I'm wrong.
Right.
Right. So I say I think I'm going to be right, but how much confidence do I have that I'm right? And if I'm absolutely dead wrong here, what's the worst case scenario? And can I live with that? Because I don't think I'm absolutely dead wrong, but let's assume that I am, because it could be true. I need to have the humility to believe that I could be. So yeah, it's something I think about a lot, but it reminds me of Aaron Brown, who's the ex-head of risk at AQR, wrote a book called Red-Blooded Risk. We've talked
Great
about it
book.
before.
Great book.
He talks about this idea of risk ignition, where he basically says taking too much risk, you end up blowing up, and taking too little risk, you basically fail to take off. And you need to take the right amount of risk. Like the goal of a risk department at an asset manager or a bank is not to just pull back risk. A good risk department should force people to take enough risk. Because if you don't take enough risk, you basically never make any return.
But also what Aaron Brown knows too well, you only know the optimal amount of risk in hindsight, right?
Absolutely.
So your band, like you're saying, the slack around the right amount of risk is really difficult. I'm not sure if you and I talked about this before, but you were talking about the anxiety we both create, always worrying about we're wrong. I was actually, when I was talking to Roni earlier today, I was like, I'm really open-minded in the sense that like, I'm not even sure all the time that like long volatility and tail risk is appropriate for portfolios. I'm always second guessing myself, right? And that's why, you and I both always second guessing every position we have. But in a way, like it makes me wonder if basically the fees we garner from running our businesses is payment for the stress we eat on a daily basis. Is like the amount of anxiety we have about everything we do on a daily basis, but then to still make those decisions under opacity and take on that risk on our shoulders and the unbelievable weight and burden that creates. To me, that's what we get. We get paid to be stress eaters for other people in a way. Just talking about it much more tangentially.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I won't pat myself too much on the back for that. That's just the job, right? I think if you care, that's the job. If you care about the money you're allocating for people, if you will have to eat that stress. But I'm not sure we get paid for it, nor am I sure people who are paying us would say that's what they're paying us for. Maybe at the end of the day, right? A lot of this is allocation, sort of like allocation rolls uphill a little bit to people who we have a degree of confidence will know what they're doing. And that also means that they have to, stomach the stress of that position.
Yeah. But I want to highlight what you said about like slacking the system and getting the right amount of risk. That like our buddy Meb talks about all the time is like just surviving in this business is the only success. And you can only do that by, having a little bit of slack in your system, not over optimizing. So no matter what cycle we're in, either risk on, risk off, or anything in between, that you can survive in this business. And that's all you really need your savings to do. And so do you have a topic you want to squeeze in this one, or can we kind of do our disclaimer and end it here?
No, I think it's time to do the disclaimer. A quick question for you. Well, live question. Are we recording live next week? You back?
I will. I think given our schedule, I think I should be able to record live. I should, but it will be from in undisclosed hotel room in Miami. In Miami. But yeah, I think we can do it live next Friday. Yeah, because I missed the comments, man. I was looking for the comments because I thought about some of the things we said, and I thought about some of the Booty Crew members are like going to completely just eviscerate me in the comments for some of the things I said, and I was like, I got clean comments today. That's good.
They can leave it in the comments in the once the video goes live. Well, everyone, thank you for tuning in. Again, apologies we can't be doing this live. We will be hopefully live back with you next week. What are you making?
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you. But you're talking about My First Million. Have you seen what they're doing lately with the gentleman's agreement?
Yeah, I hate that.
I wish we would have come up with that. But basically, for those that don't know, they do a gentleman's agreement where they say, look, we produce all this content for you every week. It costs you nothing to watch. All we ask you to do is like, subscribe, and share. And it's a gentleman's agreement. We can't check in on you, whether you do it or not. But we're here for you. You should be there for us. And I'm like, it kills me every week because I get to play with it every week. And I'm like, what a brilliant idea to have the gentleman's agreement.
I do think if you are a content consumer, do not underestimate the impact you can have for content creators like us when you do like and subscribe. It really does make a really big difference. And by the way, when you comment and like, it tells us what content you like, and we want to create more of that. So all of that is incredibly helpful, both for helping us grow the show as well as learn what we should be directing our content towards. So if you have any questions, you can always email us, ask2pirates@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter. Jason, actually, your Twitter handle changed, didn't it?
Jason C. Buck.
No, okay. Jason C. Buck. You can find me at C. Hoffstein. You can find the Pirates of Finance on Twitter. All those, hit them up if you have any questions. We really appreciate your time. Once again, this is not financial advice. Seek the help of a professional if you want to talk financials or really talk anything. If you just need someone to talk to, seek a professional. And that's it. We're out. We'll see you next week.